This is a CT scan of the patient. This showing the 15 into 14 into 17 centimeter of mass and cystic lesion with multiple internal septation, which was mostly involved with the segment left lobe of the liver. And there is another small cyst in the segment 6, which was 5 into 4 centimeter. And because of the pneumobilia, we were suspecting that there is a cystobiliary communication. The coming to the OT findings, it was a 15 into 15 centimeter mass involving the segment 2 and the 3 of the liver with a 2.5 liter of the purinate material was present. It was communicating with the left segmental hepatic duct. This is the video showing through transcystic we insert a infant feeding tube and we injected a propofol, and propofol was coming out from this segment and left lateral segment, and showing that there was a cystobiliary communication. We clipped it, and further we again injected. Then there was no further leak of the propofol. This is the final picture after removing of the cyst. We did a partial cystectomy, and this is the left lobe of the liver showing the part of the cyst over it. This is the final specimen. It is a 15 into 15 centimeter cyst. Along with that, we did a cholecystectomy and T-tube drainage because of the cystobiliary communication to decrease the cystobiliary biliary pressure. Coming to the discussion part, hydatid cyst disease, it is zoonotic parasite infection. It is most frequently caused by Echinococcus granulosus. Other organisms can be Multileucaris or Oligodarthus, but these are not common in India. These are most commonly in the Mediterranean countries. Liver is the most common involved organ. Other organ can be involved, like lung also can be involved, which is the second most common organ involved. The life cycle consists of a definitive animal with this dog, and because from the dog we got the infection into the humans or the sheep, which are intermediate host. And if the human being gets infected by the hydatid cyst, then it will be the end stage of the hydatid, because it will no further can't grow into the sexual cycle. So it will be a terminal end of that hydatid cyst. From the intestine, it will go to the liver, which is the most common involved organ in the human beings. So hydatid cyst, after becoming the mature in the human beings, it to look into the liver, at least for 3 months should be there to see a 5 centimeter of cyst in the liver. And the mature cyst consists of 3 layers. First is the germinal layer, which surrounds the fluid-filled central hydatid cyst. And this is the daughter cyst, and along with the C layer is the germinal layer. And after it is also called endocyst. And above this, all the laminated membrane, which surrounds the germinal layer. And above this adventitial layer, which is a compression of the host tissue around the endocyst, which produce a fibrous layer. It is also called ectocyst. Coming to the complication of the hydatid cyst, the most common complication is the cystic infection, and it can rupture into any of the biliary tract, bronchial tree, and the peritoneal cavity. Although the most common complication is the rupture into the biliary tract, and it can cause fever. And to see the rupture into the biliary tract, we have to do MRCP or MRI, that will cause which will cause pneumobilia, and along with that, it will we can see the hydatid cyst into the cyst CVD. And other complications are compression of the adjacent structures like bile duct, hepatic veins, and the IVC. This diagram showing the free peritoneal fluid, which shows the rupture of the hydatid cyst into the peritoneal cavity. The diagnosis, the most common serological test done is the ELISA, which has 85 to 98% of the sensitivity. Other tests like immunoblotting, which is based on antigen B, has a sensitivity of 95% and the specificity of 100%. Although ELISA is not useful in the diagnosis, it is more of useful in the epidemiological studies. Immunoblotting can be used in the diagnosis as well as epidemiology as well as post treatment also. And imaging can be done by the ultrasound, CT or MRI. MRI is more specific than the CT scan. For the confirmation, we need all the criteria: serological, clinical, and imaging. And microscopically also, we have to demonstrate the protoscoliosis. WHO has classified hydrid cyst into 6 parts. Initially, it was based on the ultrasound, but nowadays we are doing CT scan also. So it is more of a CT scan finding nowadays. First type is CL type, which is an active type. The signs are not pathognomic because it will looks like a simple cyst also, because there is no other finding. Based on the history, and we can have a differential diagnosis of hydrid cyst, CL type. Next is CE, which is cystic echinococcus 1, which is also active disease. It is a cyst wall is having with a echogenic hyperechoic, and there is a hydrid descent inside the cystic cyst. Second, and next is CE2, which is also an active disease. It is a multivesicular cyst, which is a rosette-like structure, and it is we can say also it's a rosette like. Next is CE3, which is transitional, and it shows detached laminar membrane, and it is also called as water lily sign, and it starts to degenerate, but it may produce daughter cyst, so it is still in the phase of active disease only. Next is CE4, which is an inactive, which is a heterogeneous. It will show both solid as well as a cystic component, but it doesn't have daughter cyst. And like CE5, which is also inactive. It is a thick and calcified wall, which is there is no proctoscoliosis in this. There is no chance of infection. Coming to the indication for the surgery, it is when there is a cyst wall is very large, and it is CE2 or C3b cyst with a multiple daughter vesicles, single superficial liver cyst, and a complicated cyst. But the contraindication for the surgery are when the contraindication to the anesthesia, and there is an uncomplicated CE4 or CE5 disease and very small cyst. Next is pair. Pair is puncture, aspiration, injection, and re-aspiration. In this, the indications are C1 more than 5 centimeter, C3A more than 5 centimeter, inoperable patients, that patients who refuse to undergo surgery, and relapse after the surgery, and failure to medical management. The contraindication are biliary fistula, CE2, 3B, 4, and 5. Next is medical management. We can give medical management if a patient is having less than 5 centimeter of a cyst, if patient is inoperable, refuse to go under surgery, multiple cysts are there in more than 2 organs, peritoneal cyst, and after doing surgery or pair, we have to prevent the recurrence, then we have to give medical management. The contraindication are pregnancy, uncomplicated CE4 and CE5. If a cyst is more than 10 centimeter and a risk of rupture, and because of the side effect of the medical albendazole, and we on the bone marrow and left liver function test, so we should not give on the chronic hepatic disease and bone marrow depression. Surgeries, we can do surgery like cystectomy.
Time up.
Yes, sir.
Be fast.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. Surgeries are cystectomy, radical surgery like partial pericystectomy, and total cystectomy. And the liver dissection are rarely done, which is most commonly done for multilocularis. Next is pair. The protosolicides used for the doing scolicidal agents are ethanol, hypertonic saline, and cetrimide. The contraindications are inaccessible to puncture and the close proximity to vascular structure. And if there is a rupture into the bile duct, then it will cause sclerosis cholangitis. So in that condition, we should not do pair and inject scolicidal agent. Next is medical management. Most common drug is albendazole. It is given as a dose of 10 to 15 mg per kg per day. For univesicular cyst, a definite cure requires 3 to 6 months, with an 80% success rate. Perioperatively, it should be given at least 1 week before the surgery, followed by 3 to 8 weeks for complicated disease like cystobiliary communication. And the wait and watch policy is in CE4 and CE5 types. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Now, this presentation is open for discussion. Anybody who wants to ask can raise their hand. Okay, I'm not able to see anybody raising. Then I'll invite Dr. Kannan's opinion. Professor Kannan is there. Kannan, sir.
Sorry, good evening, Babu. Sorry, I was disturbed in between by phone calls, so I didn't listen completely.
No, it's just a straightforward case of hydrolysis with cystobiliary communication. So it's just presented because of the combined hepatology and SGE group. So, any comments?
I didn't listen at all. So that's the reason.
Okay. Actually, cystobiliary communications, most of the time you should suspect because of the altered LFT. And because you have to manage the communications while performing surgery. Otherwise, this will lead on to a biliary fistula. So, most important thing is we should not use povidone iodine after opening the thing to clean the wall. And we should avoid using the povidone because it will stain the entire cyst wall and which will result in yellow discoloration. So, after evacuation, one should keep a white gauze and then try to identify any staining, biliary staining, and then we can identify the site and can be sutured. Or now propofol can be injected, and which also can show the site of leak. And our CBD can be open and this thing can be flushed with saline and can be seen through the cyst wall. So what is the bottom line is, one should identify the communication and then suture it. And treatment is generally what we do is a partial excision and evacuation. We don't do cystopericystectomy. The advantage of doing cystopericystectomy is it can result in the removal of the cyst in toto. So there is no, there won't be any resultant residual cavity. So most of these cases which are managed by partial excision and evacuation, the cavity should be managed accordingly. So we usually use the omentum for packing the cavities large. So omentum can act as a biological blotter. So any questions to the presenter? Okay. I don't see anything. Then we'll move on to the next presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, Dr. Sauram. Next is from the Institute of Medical Gastroenterology, Madras Medical College. An interesting case of foreign body in the common bile duct to be presented by Dr. Rajivan. He is the first DM postgraduate. I welcome Professor Narayanasamy, beloved Director of Institute of Herbal Sciences. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir. Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you're audible. You can just start.
Good evening, respected faculty, colleagues. I'm Dr. Rajivan, second year MG resident from MMC. Today, I'm going to present an interesting case of foreign body in the common bile duct. This is a case of a 28-year-old male who presented with a history of road traffic accident on 19/12/2020. He presented with multiple external injuries, and on presentation, he was hemodynamically stable. And among all the investigations, ultrasound abdomen was also normal. But on the next day, patient developed abdominal pain and abdominal distension. On examination, pulse was 120 per minute, BP was 110 per 70, and respiratory rate was 20 per minute. On examination, per abdomen was distended with tenderness and gouging in the right hypochondria. Lab investigations were repeated. It showed anemia. Hemoglobin was 8.9, INR was 1.42, liver function test and renal function tests were normal in this patient. So emergency ultrasound abdomen was taken, which showed free fluid in the abdomen and pelvis. Diagnostic peritoneal aspiration was done, showed presence of bile and blood. CCT abdomen showed irregular, ill-defined, non-enhancing laceration of about 7 cm in the right lobe involving segment 5, 6, 7 of liver with adjacent non-enhancing area, suggestive of grade 4 liver injury with free fluid in the abdomen and pelvis. And CT chest showed lung contusion. So the patient underwent emergency laparotomy, and in laparotomy, 3.5 liters of bilious fluid was drained from the peritoneum, and liver lacerations were noticed in segment 5 and 6. There was no active bleeding from the liver, Other solid organs and bowel appeared normal. In view of bile in the peritoneum, cholecystectomy and choledochotomy with the T2 placement was done, and the patient became hemodynamically stable. But unfortunately, on post-op day 50, patient accidentally removed the T2 by himself. The longitudinal part came out, but the horizontal part was missing. Fortunately, the patient did not have any symptoms. So on that day itself, ultrasound abdomen was done. It showed parenchymal contusion in the liver, and a small tube-like structure was noticed in the CBD, suggestive of retained T2 fragment, and a small collection in the portal hilum. MRCP on post-op day 18 showed hepatic hyperintensity suggestive of all laceration, and the T2 fragment was noticed in the CBD with fluid collection in the hepatorenal pouch. And the drainage tube was extending outward in the subcutaneous plane. After 2-3 days, the patient went against medical advice, so some of the data were missing. So after 2 months, the patient again presented to the OPD. At that time, patient was asymptomatic. He was not in cholangitis. Perabdominal examination showed midline laparotomy scar without any tenderness or palpable mass. There was no free fluid on clinical examination. Lab investigations were repeated. CBC, LFT, RFT, PTNR, everything was normal. Ultrasound repeated showed post-cholecystectomy status with no intrahepatic biliary radical dilatation. MRCP was done again on 12/3/21, showed post-cholecystectomy status with faint hyperintensity involving segment 6 and 7 of liver related to the old laceration. There was no fluid collection, but a T2 hypointense material was noted in the dilated CBD. And the CBD diameter was 8.4 mm.
I request everyone to mute their mic except the speaker.
So this is the MRCP picture showing mild hypointensity in the common bile duct extending into the right hepatic duct, suggestive of retained T2. So the final diagnosis was a blunt trauma abdomen with hepatic laceration, hemoperitoneum, and biliary ascites, status post laparotomy, cholecystectomy, and T2 placement, accidental removal of the T2 with the retained T2 fragment in the common bile duct. So the present problem patient is having is retained T2 fragment in the common bile duct. So this is a rare phenomenon. T2 placement is less frequent these days because of the availability of ERCP and other techniques for that has replaced CBD exploration. And a retained T2 fragment is again less common. About 1 to 2% of patients undergoing T2 placement only will have a retained T2 fragment as a complication. So whenever patient presents with a T2 fragment retained in the common bile duct, we should try to remove it, as this can lead to cholangitis in future, and also it can act as a nidus for stone formation. So there are two methods for removing the T2 fragment. One is endoscopic, the other one is surgical. So upper G endoscopy was done in this patient, which was normal up to D2. Then ERCP was done, CBD was cannulated, and cholangiogram was done. Cholangiogram showed T-tube, which was visualized in the common bile duct extending into the right system. Then sphincterotomy was done, and the balloon was placed beyond the T2. So in this picture, we can see the T2 extending from the CBD into the right hepatic system. So once the balloon was placed beyond the T-tube, it was inflated and balloon trolling was done. When balloon trolling was done, the T-tube came out of the ambula. In this picture, we can see the T-tube fragment coming out of the ambula, and it was endoscopically removed. And finally, this was the fragment that was retrieved from that patient. Now, after removing the T-tube, there was chance of CBD stricture as the T2 was there, T2 fragment was there. So CBD stenting was also done in this patient. Post-procedure, patient was stable and he was discharged after 2 days. Liver function test and ultrasound abdomen were repeated after 2 weeks. There was no evidence of bile leak or CBD dilatation, and patient was kept under follow-up. Now, these are some of the case reports in this context. Hack et al. Has reported a case of delayed cholangitis developing in a 36-year-old female who retained T2 fragment for 11 years, and that was removed by ERCP. Wang et al. Has reported a case of iatrogenic bile duct injury with T2 fragment retained for 10 years in a 55-year-old female that required open surgical removal of the T2. Hoffman et al. Has described a case of T2 retainment, which was removed after 9 years by ERCP. And a case of T2 fragment retained in CBD in a 76-year-old female who retained the tube for about 36 years and presented later with the cholangitis was described by Sharma et al. Coming to discussion, both T-tube and T2 fragment have got various complications. Complications of T-tube are fluid and electrolyte imbalance, Cholangitis can develop in 6%, biliary sepsis, bile leakage, and peritonitis. Retention of the fragment is a rare phenomenon, can occur in only 1.6% of the cases, and stricture formation after removal. A retained T2 fragment in the bile duct can act as a nidus for stone formation and bacterial proliferation. This can lead to chronic inflammation and cholangitis. Coming to the management of T-tube, as I said, it can be either removed surgically or endoscopically. Endoscopic procedure is less invasive. ERCP, sphincterotomy, and balloon prolling can be done to remove the T-tube. On the other hand, surgical removal might require CBD exploration with biliary reconstruction. Patient may require other like a hepaticojejunostomy, etc. might be required. So the take-home message is that whenever a retained T-tube fragment is left in the CBD, we should try to remove it as early as possible to prevent future complications. And if accessible, ERCP with balloon prolling should be tried as it is a less invasive method. And in this case, ERCP with balloon prolling has removed the T-tube and has prevented another major surgery for this patient. So these are the references. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. It's a good presentation. And we'll go for discussion. Now I welcome Professor Narayanasamy. Good evening, sir. Please unmute your mic. Unmute your mic, sir.
Able to hear me, sir, now?
Yeah, now able to hear.
Yeah. Thank you very much for you will be heading that today's meeting, because sir unable to join you on time. So a very nice restart our proceedings once again to have combined with having all the three departments, our essential department. We are catering the needs of emergency care for every aspect of the will be the most importantly required during the lockdown period also. Thank you. This will be very informative and having more thought-provoking for those budding gastroenterologists, hepatologists, and surgeons to keep in mind that we having whenever you have some procedures, you have to follow with the timely so that we can have takeaway that will be whatever the procedure later things. Otherwise, lead on to our big complication, lead on to various things. Thank you very much for the opportunity given me to join this meeting, organized by Director Surgical Gastroenterology and my one of the colleague from LPA, Dr. Prem Kumar, Dr. Joel Mohan, and Caroline Selvi. For all these been very helpful. Even unable to join in person, as well even during even virtually also I find difficulty because now and there having a whole lot of questions, queries from our department here. Thank you. With your permission, you can please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. We'll go for discussion. Any questions, comments?
Babu, can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Sir, Narayanasamy, good evening. You have become a corona warrior. So I have not heard the experience with
Dr. Kannan.
Yeah, very good. Good meeting.
Yes, sir.
I have not heard the experience with T-tube, retained T-tube. I have had cases complicated due to T-tube, like T-tube slippage, T-tube leak, like that. But the retained T-tube, I have not managed it. But I have managed a lot of stents, biliary stents. We do put a stent and then patients forget to remove it. That many cases I have managed. They come after many years with the debris blocking the T-tube, cholangitis, like that. Then I have seen 2 cases of ascariasis presenting like a foreign body in the bile duct. Dead ascarias worms.
Actually, we face problems removing the abdominal DTs. Sometimes very difficult to pull the DT. So fragmentation also can happen. All these things do happen on sporadic basis and become quite interesting cases to manage. So any other comments or experiences from other faculties can be shared? We have got 1 more minute. I think we have got Jeevan Kumar, sir. Professor Jeevan Kumar sir, any comments?
The presentation was very good, excellent. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
It will be very useful, but it is a rare case. Rare case. I have not seen such a case. But I have seen my seniors doing it with the balloon trolling and pulling the T-tube with mainly balloon trolling and with some forceps also. Retained T-tube causing some obstruction, infection, cholangitis. I have seen my seniors pulling it through balloon trolling and forceps. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. That is the only thing I have seen. But it is possible, rare case. Because I have seen only 2 or 3 cases of being removed by ERC. That too by my seniors. So maybe it is rare nowadays because of the improvement in both surgical and endoscopic techniques.
Surely. We have more endoscopic facilities now to drain the CBD. So we avoid putting. But once we open, if need be, we always put the TTP. And we do some modifications while applying the T-tube. We cut the posterior wall of the T-tube so that it will be easy while removing. In this case, I think probably that also could be one of the reasons for accidental. Okay. Yes.
For 2 weeks after polycystectomy, when they removed the T-tube, petition pending for cholangitis, sepsis, and we lost it. That is long back. Nowadays, we are not seeing such cases.
That is leak, peritubal leak.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we do upfront MRCP, do ductal clearance, and then perform lap coding. So the practice has changed now. Okay, thank you, sir.
Lot of improvement in both surgical and endoscopic techniques have come. Hereafter, these complications will be less and less.
Definitely.
Yes.
Sporadic.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Then we'll move on to, thanks, Dr. Rajavan, for a nice presentation.
Thank
We'll
you,
move
sir.
on to next presentation. That is from the Institute of Reputability Sciences, Madras Medical College. An interesting case of chronic liver disease to be presented by Dr. Anna. This is, I hope he's not Arnab. Yeah, Dr. Anna.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Proceed.
Good evening, respected faculty members. I am Dr. Arnab. I am going to present an interesting case of chronic liver disease. So, starting with a brief history, it's a 39-year-old male, unmarried, non-alcoholic, non-smoker, studied up to 7th standard, no known comorbidities. His average weight over last 15 years has been 75 to 80 kg. He presented with multiple episodes of upper GI bleed over the last 7 months. His first episode was 7 months back. It was a massive bleed with postural symptoms and melena. There was no preceding alcohol or NSAID intake, no apparent decompensation following the bleed. He was treated in a private medical center with blood transfusion, and OGD-scopy revealed grade 2 esophageal varices with red signs and mild portal hypertensive gastropathy. Although he didn't undergo any endoscopic intervention, he was treated with PPI, IV proton pump inhibitor, propranolol, and sucralfate. His initial ultrasound abdomen was suggestive of liver parenchymal disease, splenomegaly, and perisplenic collaterals. On examination, patient was also found to have hypogonadism, absent secondary sexual characters, for which he was evaluated there, and he was referred to the higher center. His second episode of upper GI bleed was 6 months back. It was also massive. Patient was resuscitated resuscitated, and referred to a tertiary care hospital. Patient was admitted to RGGH. He underwent endoscopy, which revealed large esophageal varix, one column, with large fundal varix with red color signs. He was treated with glue therapy. He was continued on non-selective beta blockers and PPI. There was no apparent decompensation. Ultrasound abdomen was suggestive of fatty liver with moderate splenomegaly, no free fluid, and no cavernous transformation of the portal vein. Liver biopsy was also done. His third episode was 1 month back. He was transferred to our unit, our liver intensive care unit. There were no further episodes of hematemesis after he was transferred. He was treated conservatively. He underwent OGD-scopy. At this time, it was small esophageal varices, and he didn't undergo any intervention thus. There was no abdominal distension, no pedal edema, no altered sensorium, no jaundice, no fever, and the bowel habits were normal. In past history, he had no prior history of similar episode prior to 7 months. There were no prior history of any liver disease. He is a non-diabetic. There is a history of congenital heart disease, probably an ASD. There was no treatment history available with the patient. He was not treated for that. There was no prior history of any other comorbidities like CKD, TB, thyroid disorder, or seizures. There was no history of any tattooing or prior blood transfusion or IV drug abuse. He is no history of any alcohol use disorder. He is a non-smoker, but there is a history of poor scholastic performance that was present. Family history: he was born out of a non-consanguineous marriage, and he had 3 elder brothers, all of which are married with children. There was no history of any similar disease in the family, no history of any endocrine disorder in the family, and no history of any malignancy or stroke or liver disease in the family. He was born out of a normal delivery, no neonatal complications. His developmental milestones were attained on time, and he completed immunization according to the schedule. On treatment history, he had blood transfusion multiple units over the past 7 months with non-selective beta blockers. He underwent OGD-scopy with glue injection, and he was on lactulose, rifaximin, and sucralfate. So here, the provisional diagnosis that first we'd like to keep was recurrent upper GI bleed, varicella with unknown etiology. Probably it could have been non-cirrhotic portal hypertension, or if it is chronic liver disease, so either it could be Wilson's or hemochromatosis or viral or NFLD related. So proceeding on, his examination, he was conscious and well-oriented to time, place, and person. He was obese. VMA was around 31.5. Pallor was present. There was no other pedal edema, no clubbing or cyanosis. There was hypopigmentation present about the left lower limb. He had absence of facial, axillary, chest, and pubic hair. Gynecomastia was present, micropenis with bilateral palpable small testes. There were no other signs of stigmata for chronic liver disease, no xanthema or xanthelasma. Systemic examination revealed mild splenomegaly, 4 cm below the left costal margin, no other organomegaly, no ascites, dilated veins, and no other back veins. External genitalia was bilateral testis was palpable, it was small, micropenis, hernial orifices were free. Other system examinations were unremarkable, and rectal examination was also normal. So this was the patient who had presence of gynecomastia and absence of the secondary sexual characters. There was no pubic hair, axillary hairs, and he had one hypopigmented patch over the left lower limb. So his investigations were, he had pancytopenia, there was no renal failure, and his blood sugar was normal. LFT was, OTPT was deranged, it was 70 and 31, and his albumin was low, it was 2.8. PTINR was deranged, it was 20.8 and 1.71. Viral markers were negative, and his peripheral blood smear suggested pancytopenia, and it was suggested for iron studies and folic acid assay. So his MELD was around 14 and CTP 9B, and his non-invasive markers of liver disease for liver fibrosis, his APRI was 4.1, FIB4 was 10.89, and NFLD fibrosis score was 2.56, all of which were suggestive of advanced fibrosis. So moving on to the other investigation, his previous OGD-scopy, as already mentioned, it had large esophageal varix with a fundal varix. He underwent glue for that. Present OGD-scopy, it showed small esophageal varices. Ultrasound abdomen, it showed liver was 12 cm, co-secos, surface irregularity noted, no IHPRD. There was moderate splenomegaly. The spleen measured around 16.3 cm with minimal ascites and left renal cortical cyst. Portal vein Doppler study, it showed intrahepatic portal vein diameter of 12 mm. It was hepatopetal flow. Peak systolic velocity was 18.4 centimeter per second. Few perisplenic collaterals, splenomegaly, and hepatic veins were having hepatofugal flow with normal caliber. Ascitic fluid analysis, ultrasound guided aspiration was unsuccessful for this patient. Autoimmune profile was negative. His iron studies were normal. Serum ceruloplasmin and 24 hours urinary copper was within normal limits. His thyroid profile was within normal limits. On a slit lamp examination, there was no evidence of any KFA. His lipid profile suggested increased triglycerides. HDL was way below the normal limit, and his cholesterol HDL ratio was decreased. On evaluation of the causes for his hypogonadism, his testosterone level was low, free testosterone was decreased, his luteinizing hormone and FSH were both decreased, although his cortisol and prolactin was normal. This was the CT finding of the patient, CT angio. The liver showed an irregular architecture with perisplenic collaterals, and it was periesophageal and perigastric collaterals. So the CT was CST was splenomegaly, liver surface nodular, multiple esophageal and perigastric collaterals, multiple splenic vein collaterals, and retropancreatic splenic vein appears dilated with moderate ascites. So the patient underwent liver biopsy. For liver biopsy, I would like to invite Dr. Kritika Madam, who is our pathologist from Department of Hepatology. Madam, can you please share your screen?
Yeah, please start. It's not audible. Not audible. No, not audible. Please switch on the mic.
On, sir.
Yeah. Not audible. Not clear. Increase the volume, please.
Now clear, sir? Is it clear, sir?
Yes.
Somewhat better, somewhat better.
Okay. Sorry for the delay. I am Dr. Kritika, Assistant Professor of Pathology. I'm going to talk about the liver biopsy of patient. So this is a hematoxin and eosin stain in scanner view showing nodules of hepatocytes separated by fibrous tissue. And this is LOPA view showing nodules of hepatocytes showing steatosis, and some cells, majority of the hepatocytes, they show ballooning degeneration, and the nodules of hepatocytes, they are separated by fibrosis. This is HYPA view showing again the steatosis and the ballooning degeneration of the hepatocytes, and this is an portal tract showing inflammation, and here we can see the steatotic cells and degenerated hepatocytes. This is a section which is done to study about the fibrosis. Here we can see that the nodules of hepatocytes are separated by fibrosis. The blue ones represent the fibrosis. These represent the cirrhotic nodules. So in liver biopsy, the positive findings include steatosis, ballooning degeneration of hepatocytes, and there was mild lymphoplasmacytic infiltrate in portal tracts and lobules. And finally, we can see cirrhotic nodules. So with this histopathological finding, we have the following differential diagnosis. That is chronic viral hepatitis, autoimmune hepatitis, Wilson's disease, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, alcoholic steatohepatitis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And finally, we should rule out drug-induced liver injury and cholestatic diseases. As the clinical features and investigations, they indicate that is they rule out chronic viral hepatitis, autoimmune hepatitis, Wilson's disease, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and since patient doesn't have alcoholic history, it also rules out alcoholic steatohepatitis, and we rule out drug-induced also. On the histopathological changes, in chronic viral hepatitis, there should be characteristic feature is spotty necrosis and confluent lytic necrosis, in addition to interface necrosis, interface hepatitis. In our case, all these three were absent. We have only steatosis with cirrhosis and mild inflammation. So even in histopathology, we rule out chronic viral hepatitis. Next differential is autoimmune hepatitis. To say it is an autoimmune hepatitis, it can be histologically, it can be typical, compatible, or atypical. To say it is a typical autoimmune hepatitis, it should have interface hepatitis, hepatocyte rosette formation, emperipolysis. And to say it is compatible, we should have features of chronic hepatitis with lymphocytic infiltration. And if it is atypical, no features, above features will be present. So with this, we are ruling out autoimmune hepatitis. And close DD for the above case is alcoholic liver disease, where also we'll see steatosis and inflammatory cells with fibrosis and characteristic Mallory-Denk bodies. But alcoholic history is absent in our patient, so that also is ruled out. And finally, we have to rule out cholestatic disease. The characteristic features of cholestatic disease, such as cholestasis and cholestasis, that river rosettes are absent. So we are ruling out this. So finally, based on the liver biopsy, we narrowed down to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease bar non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. A few words about NAFLD based on pathological features. It can be on histopathology, it can be either two categories. That is, it can be simple steatosis or it can present as non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Simple steatosis is more common and it has a benign clinical course, whereas non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is represent 1/3 of the disease and it is progressive disease with cirrhosis. And the characteristic features of NAFLD include steatosis, which is more of macrovesicular steatosis than microvesicular, and we see perisinusoidal fibrosis. In addition to this, we will see inflammatory infiltrates, and in later stages, we will see fibrosis extending towards other portal tracts and then leading to cirrhosis. There is the grading of histopathological grading of NASH. It is graded as 1, 2, and 3. That is mild, moderate, or severe, based on the findings such as steatosis, hepatocyte ballooning, intralobular inflammation, and portal inflammation. And we have another score, which is NAFLD activity score or NAS score. It is also based on the same features, that is steatosis, lobular inflammation, and ballooning. This score, the total comes to about 8, and if it is more than 5, we can say it is confirmative of NASH, and it can progress to severe disease. Just a few words about pediatric NAFLD or NASH. It differs from the adult type in that it has two types, type 1 and 2. Type 2 is more common than the type 1. And type 1, the histopathological features will be similar to the adult one. Whereas in type 2, instead of lobular inflammation, there will be more of portal inflammation and portal fibrosis. And the ballooning hepatocytes and perisinusoidal fibrosis will be absent in comparative to the adult. And type 2, it occurs in a more younger age and it is associated with greater degree of obesity. And as we all know, it can progress to hepatocellular carcinoma. NASH has higher instance of hepatocellular carcinoma. And in 2010, a new variety known as steatohepatitis hepatocellular carcinoma was identified. That is, the hepatocellular carcinoma arising in the background of NASH was different than the other classical hepatocellular carcinoma. That is, they have, in addition to the pleomorphic hepatocytes, they have inflammatory cells, and then steatosis will be present in between the neoplastic cells. So, with all the above findings, we have the liver biopsy was given as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Thank you.
Dr. Kritika, do you have one more presentation, or this is the slide of the month?
Sir. Same presentation, only one, sir.
So thank you, both of you, for a wonderful presentation. We'll move on to discussion part. So I invite now comments from the faculty and students. Anybody would like to make any comments? I think the postgraduates should actively take part. It's not be one way. Then I invite Dr. Prem Kumar is there?
Sir, postgraduate has to present the discussion part also. He has some of the few slides.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Arnab, continue.
Yes. So the final diagnosis in this patient was, it was a case of chronic liver disease, cirrhosis with portal hypertension, recurrent upper GI bleed, large esophageal varices with gastric varices with post-flu. Etiology in this case was NASH related, associated with hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, and he was not in HE, AKI or SBP with grade 2 obesity and dyslipidemia. So in discussion, NAFLD is the likely cause of most causes of cryptogenic cirrhosis. It is the second most common cause in indication for liver transplantation. China, Japan, Korea, and including US, they have reported prevalence rates of around 10 to 24%. Most cases of NAFLD in the middle age during the 4 to 6 decades. Increased frequency in children and adolescents has also been reported due to the increased frequency of overweight and obesity. Low serum testosterone levels in men are associated with an increased risk of obesity, metabolic syndrome, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The prevalence rate of NFLD in male hypogonadotropic hypogonadism patient was reported to be around 34.9%. It was way higher than the normal prevalence of NFLD in the general population. And there are several mechanisms that might explain this inverse association, like increased adipose tissue lipolysis, increased hepatic lipogenesis, decreased hepatic fatty oxidation, fatty beta oxidation, and decreased export of lipids from the liver. It was reported in a study by Kim et al. In 2012. So low-grade inflammation could also be a link between testosterone and NFLD. Low serum testosterone is associated with markers of inflammation, and it is a known fact that the chronic inflammatory state is the fundamental to the progress of NFLD. So therefore, our patient, who is a case of idiopathic hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, who did not attain puberty at all, has progressed from NFLD to NASH-related cirrhosis and presented with recurrent upper GI bleed. He had low levels of free or total testosterone, and this has been consistently been associated with overall or abdominal obesity, which accelerates the NFLD progression, leading on to insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, and dyslipidemia. Study by Kim Sunmei et al. Showed that as the serum testosterone level decreased from the fifth quintile to the first quintile, the adjusted odds ratio for NFLD increased. So the occurrence of endocrine disturbances in patients with hepatic cirrhosis has been known for many years. Whether it be growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor-related abnormalities, it is responsible for lipid and carbohydrate metabolism, insulin resistant and low bone mass. Thyroid dysfunction has been reported to be around 13 to 61% in patients with liver cirrhosis. Bone-related disorders in cirrhosis, mostly osteoporosis, but osteomalacia has also been reported. Adrenal insufficiencies has been reported in both in compensated and stable cirrhosis as well as in cirrhotic patients. Hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis in liver cirrhosis resulting into hypogonadism has been frequently reported. Gynecomastia, decreased libido, signs of feminization, testicular atrophy, and low testosterone level. Metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance in liver disease are not only prevalent among patients with liver disease, but also can be seen after liver transplantation. And in endocrine abnormalities, hereditary hemochromatosis, it has been seen liver cirrhosis, diabetes, cardiomyopathy, hypogonadism, and arthropathy are prevalent. So I would like to conclude that emerging data implicating androgens in the pathogenesis of NFLD is important, is of relevance to hypogonadal man. Visceral adiposity is a significant risk factor for the development of fibrosis. Testosterone replacement in hypogonadal man causes a significant reduction in weight, BMI, waist circumference, and circulating TNF-alpha. Non-diabetic middle-aged man with low testosterone concentration is more likely to have the metabolic syndrome. Endocrine problems in patients with chronic liver disease are common and can cause considerable diagnostic and therapeutic confusion. Each individual patient must be carefully assessed to make a correct diagnosis, whether be it hemochromatosis, Wilson's disease, resectable tumors, or a primary endocrine disease, which was the cause in our case. An effective treatment and even cure may be possible in these patients. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So we'll go for discussion. Any comments? So Dr. Premkumar, you can take over and give your comments.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Actually, this case has been presented for its rarity. This patient, 39 years old male, presented with decompensation in the form of variceal bleeding, and clinical examination showed hypogonadism features. So hypogonadism, we know the secondary hypogonadism is very common in cirrhotic patients, and 50 to 75% of patients with chronic liver disease has secondary hypogonadism in the form of loss of, that is testicular atrophy, loss of secondary sexual characters in the form of axillary and pubic hair. This can occur, but in this adult has presented with prepubertal form of secondary hypogonadism, and the chronic liver disease cause could be pediatric NAFLD, onset of NAFLD in the pediatric age group itself. And this has led to early development of cirrhosis at the age of 39 years. So the prepubertal onset can be noted by the underdeveloped testis, lack of the penile enlargement, and as usual, the absence of pubic and axillary and the facial hair. So this is very, very rare. The case has been presented for its rarities. And a few questions to the presenter. So whether the endocrine opinion, he has not mentioned about the endocrine opinion, whether it has been obtained on.
Yes, sir. I would like to say that the endocrine opinion was obtained, sir, and they have labeled it the case of idiopathic hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism.
Whether any MRI brain was taken to rule out empty cellular syndrome. So,
yes, sir. MRI brain was normal in this patient.
MRI brain was normal.
Yes.
Okay.
He was started on testosterone by the endocrine department.
Okay. So he is undergoing treatment for hypogonadism with testosterone. How much you are giving and how many doses has been planned?
So initially he has been planned for 100 microgram deep IM for a period of 2 weeks. Then he will be followed up in the endocrine OPD, and then further course of action will be taken.
So already patient has developed cirrhosis.
Yes,
will it be useful? Androgen therapy is useful?
No, sir. In this patient, since he has already developed cirrhosis, so endocrine supplementation in this patient will not be of much help for the patient.
Okay. Then why we are continuing?
In regard to liver disease.
With regard to liver, that it is not useful. But
yes,
regard to the hypogonadism or any other thing, is it useful?
Sir, actually on discussion with the endocrinologist, they say that in regard to the hypogonadism and the other sexual characters, it can be useful if the patient is supplemented with testosterone.
Okay, doctor. Thank you very much.
What is the ultimate treatment for this patient?
So ultimately, patient has gone in for cirrhosis. Whatever may be the further treatment is mainly the to reduce the portal hypertension. We are giving beta blockers as well as liver supportive drugs.
What about transplant?
Sir, presently the patient is in child B status and the MELD is around 11 or
14. Sir.
14. So 39 years old female, old male, we can plan for liver transplantation if the suitable donor is available.
Any other comments? Then if there are no more comments or questions, then shall we close the session? Dr. Prem Kumar?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for kindly chairing the session.
So thank you. I thank my co-chairpersons. I thank all the presenters and participants and also the sponsors for this meeting, Jairus. So thank you one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.